Okay, 10:01, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I will just say hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us again today. My name's Will Simons. Pleasure to be with you again. We had a great turnout for a class, last class 2 weeks ago. That was Fundamentals of Reserves. Don't worry if you happen to miss that class. We do have a recording of that. So everybody that attended should have gotten a link to that recording. Anybody who's interested in seeing that last class, feel free to email me or reach out to one of your colleagues. We'll be happy to share that. We're going to be recording today's class as well. Some of the material that I'll cover in today's class is going to be kind of building blocks, picking up from where the last one left off. So if you didn't happen to see that one, if you feel like you missed a concept, particularly the subject of percent funded is going to be very important, feel free to go back and watch that class later on. Hopefully this time around, we won't have any of those technical difficulties. Unfortunately, our building's internet connection dropped out about 25 minutes into last week's class, which was very frustrating. I'm sure very confusing for everybody. So sorry about that. Hopefully that doesn't happen again, but I feel like I just have to warn you, if it does, if you see me freeze up, if you can't hear anything or see anything anymore, if the connection drops out, hang on, stay in the meeting. I will try to reconnect it as soon as we can, and we'll pick up where we left off. But again, hopefully that's a non-issue today. So fingers crossed for that one. Thanks again to Christina DeMornay. She helped me to put this on today. So thanks, Christina. I really appreciate your help in gathering the group together. Today's class will actually be a little bit shorter than the last one. So hopefully we'll have even more time for Q&A. So as the class goes on today, feel free to ask any questions that you have through the Q&A button on the Zoom taskbar. And then when we get to the end of the course, we'll have should have plenty of time to go through all those questions. I'll stay on as long as you guys like. As long as there's still questions coming in, I will be available to answer those for you. Again, feel free to share the class, share the material, the recording. We're going to give out copies of the slides. So if you have any colleagues, any board members that you think might benefit from this information, please feel free to share that with them. It's perfectly fine. None of this is confidential or proprietary. We're here to give this information out to the world. So thank you again. I'll switch my camera off and we will get started here in just a moment with the slides. Okay. Now we're up to 22 people, so that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, all right. So again, I'll give myself a quick introduction. My name is Will Simons. I'll be teaching today's class. This one is called Reserve Funding Methodologies. This is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit in either the insurance and financial management section or as an elective. When you registered, you provided us with your first name, last name, and CAM license number. So we should have everybody's information on file. If you're unsure, you just want to double check, feel free to email us or submit that through the chat, and we'll make sure that everyone gets credit for the class today. I think we're going to have mostly managers on the class, but this class is certainly not just for managers. This is great information for board members, committee members, really anybody who's involved in the budgeting process for community associations. So again, please feel free to share this. This is, I would say, more of an intermediate level class, touching on some more sophisticated topics than we did last time. So hopefully this is very relevant to you all today. As I mentioned, we'll be giving out copies of the slides. So if you feel that you wanted to go back and look at something in more detail, don't worry, we are going to have those for everybody later on. So we'll be sending those automatically. You don't need to request a copy of the presentation. We will be sending that out. Okay, I'll just take a moment. My name again, Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. I've been with our company since 2008. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that's only awarded to people who have demonstrated their expertise and experience in preparing reserve studies. It comes from CAI. As of right now, we have 5 reserve specialists on our Florida staff, but a couple of dozen spread out amongst the rest of our offices around the country. I've lived in both condos and HOAs, spent about 6 years serving on the board of my own community. We had a budget there of about $1 million. It was a 635 home HOA. And the reason I always point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, having to work with volunteers, working with management, and volunteering my time to take on this major responsibility of budgeting and helping to run an association. So Thank you again for all your time. I do appreciate you guys being here today. Real briefly, our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in the business now since 1986. We've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. We have 12 offices throughout the US. We have more reserve specialists on staff than any other company. I always point out that the majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which of course includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, and other residential types of properties. But we also have a great deal of experience with other property types: office buildings, hotels, resort properties, worship facilities, schools. Basically, if you have a roof, if you have a parking lot, if you have an air conditioner, if you have any physical assets whatsoever, you should have a plan for how to replace those things, and that's what our job is. Our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. We are not an engineering firm or an accounting firm. We focus very specifically on doing this one thing really well. We feel that it's our job to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies that those properties then use to forecast and budget for their major projects. If we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we help them design, then hopefully they have a reduced risk of special assessments and bank loans and other forms of financial distress. Down in the bottom right corner of the screen, you have a link to our website, reservestudy.com. So please feel free to visit that site. We have a ton of great content on there. Of course, you can also email me anytime. My email address, which we'll have up on the screen later as well, is wsimons@reservestudy.com. That's WSIMONS@reservestudy.com. Okay. So let's get into today's material. I'm going to start off with this brief outline talking about what this course consists of today. Really, we just have two sections. The first section is going to focus on the philosophy, the reasoning behind why it's important to have reserves at all. Okay. So in other words, why is it not okay for an association to just pass a special assessment or go out and get a loan every time it needs to take on a big project? In our last class, we spent a lot of time going over the percent funded concept. That's going to be very important to us now. Going back to that question of why have reserves, now that we've covered the percent funded topic in our last class, you may remember those graphs and charts showing the correlation of risk between low percent funded and high chances of special assessment, but also a higher instance or a higher likelihood of better property values for communities that have well-funded reserves. The second part of the course, really the main part of the course, is going to be a detailed overview of the two different reserve funding methodologies. There you go. There's the title of the course. Those are known as the pooled method and the straight line method. So we will get to those in a few minutes. But first, we have this basic question: why have reserves at all? Okay, so I want to put this in perspective and pose this kind of hypothetical question. So I want you guys to take a moment and think about this one. Pretty basic question. What are reserves for? Why do associations collect reserves? And more specifically, is it for the here and now, or is it for the future? So think about that for a moment. Okay, it's always nice when I used to teach this class in public in the pre-COVID days when we could have people give me a show of hands. So just think about that for a moment. Raise your hand if you think it's for the here and now or for the future. And I'll go ahead and give you my answer, which is for the here and now. Okay. Now, if you were in the group that said for the future, you are not alone. Most of the people that I asked that question will raise their hands when they say, you reserve for the future. I think it's a critical point to make, and I'm going to explain why, which is that reserve funding should be thought of as for the here and now. So we think it's a misunderstanding to think of reserve funding as, saving up for some future project. The reason why that's not a great approach is that there's a very good chance that the current owners that live in an association won't be there by the time those future projects take place. So they could argue, and it might make sense, that they shouldn't be funding reserves towards some future project that they won't be around to benefit from. I'm sure all of you managers have heard that one before. So let's encourage those people to think of this in a different way. Okay, if you think of reserve funding more like paying a current bill of deterioration that is taking place in the present day, I would say that's the more appropriate way to think of it, kind of like this pay-as-you-go model. All right, let me give you a quick example. Okay, so let's say that I were to buy a unit in a brand new condo building, and let's assume that the roof on that building has a 20-year lifespan. Now, if I'm going to live there, let's say for the first 15 years of that building's existence, that means I will be enjoying 15 years of use and value out of the roof, not to mention all the other building components, the mechanical systems, the swimming pool, the tennis courts, and so on. Now, let's say I want to sell my unit after those 15 years, and the incoming buyer, the one who bought it from me, is going to live there for the next 15 years. Okay, but let's do the math. Only 5 years after they bought my unit, that 20-year roof is going to need to be replaced. And this is where it gets tricky. If I had not been charged accordingly during the time that I lived there, meaning that I wasn't being assessed my portion of the cost of the roof through reserve funding, then the new buyer is essentially going to get stuck with the full cost of the replacement project, right? At that point, they will have only lived there for 5 years or 25% of the roof's lifespan. But if I wasn't paying into reserves, then they essentially have to pay my bill and theirs. They're paying the full 20-year worth of cost. They're paying their share of the life of the roof, but also my share, even though I've moved away. Okay, so now you may be wondering, well, so what? Well, if you're the second buyer and you're deciding between associations to buy a unit in, now the fact that my association doesn't have a healthy reserve fund would mean that you as the new buyer are going to be exposed to more cost and probably a higher chance of a special assessment to make up for those years in which I was not being charged my fair share. And we know how that plays out. That takes the form of a special assessment typically. All right, and we all know what that means in terms of property value. Okay, in our business, we talk about these 4 rules. The first rule is that these expenses we're talking about, that we're planning for, these are inevitable. There is no getting around the fact that your air conditioning system will need to be replaced, your elevators will need to be modernized, your roads will need to be repaved, and so on. Number 2, the board is always responsible. They're the ones entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all the owners. Next up, when projects get delayed, they tend to get more expensive. And we see this all the time, especially in the case of things like roofs and concrete restoration, building envelope, mechanical type components, things that if they are allowed to get worse, they get more and more and more expensive over time. Now, the last one, most importantly, the homeowners will always be the ones paying the bill. Okay, there's no Uncle Sam, there's no government bailout coming for community associations that are not funding their reserves properly. Okay, just like there are 4 rules for reserve planning, there are also 4 options for how to eventually pay for those things. So the first and best option, of course, is to have a healthy reserve fund. The second best option is to pass special assessments when those things come along. Now, I always kind of joke, it should be obvious that that's a bad option when the second best option on the table comes with a skull and crossbones warning on it. Of course, if you've ever managed or even lived in a community association that has those recurring special assessments, you know what I mean. It's a toxic thing for a community to go through. Okay, the next best option would be to take out a loan or a line of credit to pay for a project. And the reason I have that one ranked after a special assessment is because, of course, the cost of the project will ultimately be greater due to the cost of the financing involved. Okay, now what happens if you don't do any of those 3? Well, then your only choice is to let the property fall into disrepair, right? If you don't pay any money out of pocket up front to take care of it, then eventually you'll just suffer from a decline in property values and it hits all the owners in the pocketbook that way. And for those of you who attended our first class 2 weeks ago, the fundamentals of reserves, you'll remember all those Hall of Shame pictures. Those are the ones that chose not to do anything. They didn't reserve, they didn't have special assessments, they didn't have loans. They just let the place fall apart, and all those photos are pretty indicative of what happens at that point. Okay, so here's some of the specific benefits of having a reserve fund. You know, obviously, we're going to be pretty consistent on this point, but starting at the top, you shouldn't have any surprises, or at least a much lower chance of getting caught by surprise. Okay, if you're funding your reserves, if you're paying attention, that means you're tracking the remaining life expectancies of your components, which should give you the option to plan ahead and prepare for when they need to be replaced, rather than reacting and getting caught by surprise when something fails, when something breaks. When you're planning ahead, that also gives you the chance to shop around, select from different providers. Having time on your side gives you the ability to seek out more bids, try to minimize cost by working with different contractors, maybe hiring a consultant to help you narrow down your scope of work. Another example could be that you talk to your painting company and you find out, when is the best time of year for us to work with you? Do you have a slow season? Can we get a better price at some time of year? On the flip side, if you're calling out to those contractors on an emergency basis because it's the 4th of July and your cooling tower just broke down, well, now you're going to get stuck paying a much higher fee because of it. It's a rush. It's an emergency at that point. Okay. Now, the point here about minimizing exposure is mostly relevant to board members. What I mean here is that if you are proactively taking care of the property, if you're doing an accurate, reliable, responsible job of funding reserves, you're doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty. That will give you better protection against any potential complaints, any lawsuits, any pushback you'll get from the owners. Now, the last point on the slide here is that if you're doing all of these things, that naturally leads to increasing property values. We talked about that in the last class. But again, in our experience, communities that are doing a good job of reserve funding will tend to have better curb appeal. They're more up to date with respect to technology. They have more modern amenities than the ones that don't. All of that contributes to a better ownership experience for the people who live there, which in turn makes them more attractive to potential buyers. It's this virtuous cycle. And you guys as managers, I'm sure, would probably agree that properties that are in a good financial position where things are going smoothly, that makes your job easier as a manager too. Okay, of course, all the opposites are true. If you don't have a healthy reserve fund, you're going to be more exposed to surprises, which can lead to higher expenses, more liability exposure, and ultimately declining property values. The real problem with this is that when we see communities getting into this sort of pattern, it becomes more and more difficult to break out of it each year. If you're continuing to partially fund your reserves, if you're waiving your reserves over time, you're just digging yourself a deeper and deeper hole. It's going to be very difficult to climb out of. I'm sure you guys, when you work on your annual budgets, have seen that before. Okay, so we'll talk in just a moment here about the main part of the class, which is maybe the most important, at least for some of you guys out there. Very complicated, misunderstood topic, I would say, but we're going to talk about the two ways that associations can actually create their budgets and how they calculate the amount of funding that's reserved, or excuse me, that's required each year for reserves. All right, first, I'm going to go over what we call the straight line method. The other term for this method is called the component method. The reason for that is because all components in this method are treated separately from a funding standpoint. So personally, I think of this as kind of the old-fashioned way. More and more communities are switching to the pooled method. Part of the reason why it's the old-fashioned way is because prior to 2002, at least in the state of Florida, it was the only approved method. You couldn't use the pooled method yet until after 2002. And the way that I characterize this method is that it's simple in theory, but it starts to become real troublesome, real complicated when you try to put it into practice. But first, we'll just talk about how it works. So if you want to understand the method, I think it's very helpful if you think of each category of reserve components as being handled in separate buckets. So for right now, let's assume that we're talking about these 5 buckets. We'll say it's for the roof, elevator, painting, mechanical, and pavement. Okay. When you're doing this method, each year you determine the amount of funding going into each bucket using a pretty simple calculation. Basically, you take the cost of the component, you subtract out any existing funds that you've already saved, that you've already got in the bank for that component, and you take the remaining difference and divide it by the remaining useful life for that component. Okay, the result of that calculation then tells you this is the amount required to, quote, fully fund that component in the following year's budget. Okay, so we'll use the roof reserve, the roof bucket as our first example. If you understand that the total volume of bucket, the total capacity, represents the total cost to replace the roof, and if you think of your existing reserves for roof replacement as being the contents of that bucket, The empty portion, right, the difference here, that's what we could call the unfunded balance. It's basically the difference between the total cost to replace the roof, subtracting out the existing roof reserve cash we've already got on hand. Okay, so if we put some actual numbers to it, let's say that the cost of the roof is $200,000, and let's assume we have $140,000 in existing reserves. That means our unfunded balance, the amount we still have yet to collect, is $60,000. Okay. Now, in order to determine how much I need to be funding for my roof reserve going forward, I would then take my $200,000 cost, I subtract out the 140 grand in existing reserves, and I'm going to take the difference and divide that by the remaining life. Okay, so for this exercise, let's say we've determined that the remaining life is only 3 years. So I'll take 200,000 minus 140, and I get 60,000, which I then divide by 3, and that tells me it's $20,000 each year for the next 3 years to fully fund my roof replacement project. Okay, now in order to do the rest of the budget, I'm basically just going to repeat that process for each of those remaining buckets. And as this plays out over time, you can see how you end up with a variety of different positions, right? Depending on how accurate your assumptions were for life expectancies and costs, some of your accounts may be really well funded while others are not. Now, and when you look at this in this kind of graphic picture here, this makes for an inefficient distribution of all of the association's total reserve cash, right? In other words, money might be locked up in one account when it would be very advantageous to move it over to something else, maybe for a project that's a higher priority, but you can't do that, or at least not without a vote of the owners, and that starts to get very complicated. Okay, so here are some of the problems that we've identified with this straight line method. First, it's very often the case that there has been no prior reserve fund established for something important, something like concrete restoration, for example. Or the funds might be too broadly defined. For example, we sometimes see one large combined account that's just labeled as mechanical, like I had in my example there. Now, that mechanical group is supposed to try and capture everything from security cameras to fire alarms to cooling towers, all of which have very different life expectancies, very different replacement costs. And if you're combining those into one really broad general category, now you're going to have to start to do some pretty complicated math to figure out, how do I determine the amount of funding going into this one account that's meant to be used for all these different things? Okay. From a management standpoint, I've seen this method become much more of a headache. Now, why is that? Well, under the method, the statutes require that the owners vote to approve the moving of funds from one place to another. For example, from elevator reserves to parking lot reserves or vice versa. And you guys all know that getting a quorum and passing a vote for anything at all is a very difficult task, but especially when it comes to moving money around. Okay, residents are often very skeptical of their boards and hesitant to give that approval unless they fully understand the situation, which means that the board and the manager sometimes have to call special meetings, send a ton of emails, get the attorneys involved. Just becomes kind of a huge administrative nightmare, big headache. Now, lastly, and probably the most serious flaw with this method is that because it's more conservative, associations aren't making the most efficient use of all their available cash. That will end up costing the owners in the association more money each year to fully fund their reserves. So I'll just give you a kind of a little sidebar explanation here. Each year at the end of the year, we look back at all the reserve studies we've produced, and we have lots of clients that are using the straight line method. I think it's about a third of our clients are still using that. Now, when we do their reserve studies, we give them the recommendations using the straight line method, but we also show them what it would look like if they were to pool their reserves and combine everything into one pool of funds so they can see the difference. And last year when we did that, and again, this is a sample size of hundreds of reserve studies, we found that the average difference between the two methods was about 200%. Okay, let me say that again. On average, our clients would require triple the amount of funding from their owners if they use the straight line method, if they stay with that method, compared to if they pool their reserves together. Now, given that basically every single association we've ever worked with has been trying to cut their costs and lower their assessments, keep their budget a little bit tighter, one easy way we're able to help them do that is to teach them about pooled reserves. And more each year, we find associations making the switch and never looking back. Okay, so let's talk about that better option, the pooled method. This is also known as the cash flow method, and in our opinion, this is absolutely the way to go. Again, for background, the method has only been improved in Florida since 2002, but I can tell you, because we're a national company, outside of Florida, this method is universal. Okay, I mentioned earlier, we have 12 offices throughout the US. Our Florida office is the only one that ever has to do this, the old straight line method. Now, the way I want to contrast this one is that the pooled method is maybe a little bit more complex in theory, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually much simpler to use for budgeting. One of the most common questions that I get when I give this class is, well, if we have the straight line method now, but we're interested to switch to the pooled method, how do we do that? So I put this slide together to talk about that process. Let me be clear. First and foremost, the board itself can create a new pooled account all on its own. Okay. So for example, the board can say that as of this upcoming fiscal year, as of next year, all of our new incoming reserve contributions will be going into this new pool of funds we've created. That itself does not require any ownership vote. However, if the board wants to move money from the existing straight line accounts into the new pool of funds, that's what is going to require the vote. Okay, the owners would have to approve that. It's basically the same idea as moving funds from one reserve account to another in the straight line method. It's considered what they call a non-scheduled use of those reserve funds. So the same voting process is required as if you were moving money from your painting reserve to your elevator reserve. Now, the good news is that the vote to move those funds is a one-time process. You don't have to take that vote every year when you adopt the budget. Okay. Now, a real important point here at the end, I would highly recommend that you involve the association CPA, maybe even your attorney, to help make sure that you're going through that process correctly. If you have a reserve study provider you're working with, absolutely involve them as well, get their input. But most of the communities that we see that go through that method, are very, very happy with the outcome. All right. So the best way that I found to explain the pooled method is going back to that same bucket analogy. Okay. So when we were talking about the straight line method, that we had all those separate buckets of cash. Now visualize that you're going to take all of those separate buckets and dump them into one big bathtub. Now, once we've done that, we've essentially removed the labels from any specific categories of reserve funds. In this case, now all of the reserve money is collectively available for any component that's on the list. So in other words, there's no such thing anymore as roof reserves or painting reserves or elevator reserves or anything else. It is all just reserve cash that can be spent much more effectively, much more efficiently. Okay, we're going to talk through the process of how you develop your budget using the pooled method, but really important to point out the first step of the process is the same in either method, which is to have a good solid reserve component list, right? That's the foundation of any good budget, is you have accurate data for life expectancies and costs for all the assets. If you don't have that, then you're really sunk. Nothing else really matters at that point. But let's say you've done that work, you have the accurate component list, you know how long things will last and what they will cost to replace. Now you can look forward and design a timeline of future expenses, right? You can look at when things will expire based on their remaining life and what their cost will be at some point in the future, and you put together a timeline. Okay, most reserve studies will include a 30-year forecast, and that allows us to show what the approximate amounts are that are going to be spent in any given year. You don't need a reserve study to do this, though. You can put this together on a spreadsheet and basically just figure out in each of the next 30 years, based on what's set to expire that year and its assumption for cost, these are the numbers we're going to be facing. Okay, now this is going to be a kind of a multi-step process here, but The idea is that once you know what your future expenditures will look like, the next step is to determine how much money needs to go into the reserve account in order to meet those expenses. Right? It's a fairly straightforward process, but we're going to talk it through together. The first thing we need to do when you're using the pooled method is you're going to determine the sum total of all of your reserve cash at the start of the fiscal year. Okay. The next step is you plug in an amount for estimated income to that reserve account, which can be a combination of budgeted reserve contributions. Maybe what you do is you just take the last year's reserve budget and model that forward. Say, what if we do the same as last year? How does that work? Now, you can also, in the pooled method, factor in some interest earnings. Okay. It's another important advantage over the straight line method. When you're using straight line, there is no future. There is no timeline for interest earnings that play out over many years. So you're not able to factor that into your overall income. Okay, the next step then is to look back at the forecast of expenses, and you look at what estimated costs are on the schedule for that first year. From there, you're going to do the math. Okay, you take your starting cash position, you add the reserve income, the cash going into reserves for that year. You subtract out the amounts for any expenses you've got planned, and you'll see what that does to the reserve account balance at the end of the year. You know, if you're going to start the following fiscal year, obviously you have to make sure that there's still some money in the bank. If not, okay, if you've modeled your cash in and your cash out and that bleeds everything dry, then obviously you need to use a higher contribution rate for that initial year. You're not allowed to design a plan that has you go below zero. We'll talk about that more in just a few moments. Now, the beauty of doing this using an Excel spreadsheet or other type of software is that you can set up a model that shows the same types of projections for many years at a time, 10, 20, 30 years. It only takes a few seconds to set up some formulas, and that shows you how much money you'll be spending over those remaining years, and therefore how much money you need to contribute in all those years in order to keep your account balance at a safe level. Okay. I know I just covered a lot of steps in that one slide, so feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A, and I'd be glad to go through this in more detail later on. But first, I want to go over this next really important point. There are differences of opinion over what is considered to be a safe level. Basically, what it amounts to are there are three possible funding objectives. When you're using the pooled method, you're trying to figure out how much money to put in the bank. There's three options on the table: baseline funding, full funding, and what we call threshold funding. And we'll break each one down. Okay. I want to talk about the first possible objective, which is called baseline funding. Okay, I'm not going to mince words here. This is the riskiest option on the table. This is the option that is most likely to end in financial disaster. Now, it's perfectly legal to do, but for most communities, this is not a good idea. Basically, the objective here is that you're figuring out what is the bare minimum amount of money you need to put into reserves to keep your account balance above zero throughout the forecasted timeline. Okay. I want to make this really clear. When I talk with managers and accountants, it seems that there is a disconnect in the terminology here. And this isn't really anybody's fault, but it's just something that's developed over time. The problem is that if you talk to most people in Florida and you ask them what they mean by fully funding a pooled reserve fund, what they will describe is what I'm now telling you is called baseline funding. It's the minimum required by law that if you don't do it, then you'll have to get a vote of the owners to approve something less than that. Okay, so what most boards, what CAMs usually want to know is, what's that amount? What is the amount of money that we need to put into the budget each year so that we don't have to go to the owners and get a vote to approve something less? And I'm sure you've all seen that block of text that goes into the budget. If the owners want to do less than this baseline amount, there's the, all caps text that says something to the effect of, partially funding or waiving of reserves will result in a higher likelihood of special assessments. You guys know what I'm talking about. But basically, the law says that that amount, the number that needs to be put in the budget to avoid a vote, is simply the amount that would be required to keep a positive cash balance in the reserves in each year of your analysis. anything above $0 is acceptable. So you could have $2, $3, $4 in your account at the end of a year. That is legal, okay? This is the actual language that's published in the legislation with respect to pooled funding, okay? Basically says what I've been saying, that your contribution rate needs to be enough so that over time your cash inflows are greater than your cash outflows, but that's it. There's no other requirements to go along with it. Now, if you take the time to actually read through the legislation, the term fully funding is actually not used anywhere with respect to the pooled method. It is with straight line, but with the pooled method, the closest thing I could find was the term sufficient funds. Now, the DBPR has a manual, some of you may be familiar with this, that they publish, which is a guide that's used by managers and board members that explains how to design a pooled funding budget, how to go through that calculation. In the example that they use in that manual, the association they're talking about gets to a point where they only have $4 in their reserve account, and the state says this is sufficient. All right, now before I go on, just think to yourselves for a moment. Does anybody out there, board member, manager, whoever hears the sound of my voice, would you ever think that it's a good idea for a community association to have $4 in its reserve account? Now, we obviously don't think so, and I think you guys would all recognize that's a pretty dangerous approach to take. Obviously, if you're just doing the bare minimum, it only takes one problem, one thing going wrong to blow up that plan. Now, that could be a project that happens a little bit earlier than you anticipated or costing a little bit more than you thought. The point is, if you're trying to thread the needle that closely, if you have no margin for error, then the chances that you'll need special assessments or you'll have to go get loans are very, very high. And again, going back to the beginning, if one of the main reasons why we fund reserves is to prevent that stuff from happening, then I hope you would agree that baseline funding is, although it's permissible, it's legal, probably not a great idea for most communities. Okay, if you look at this table here, this is a real world example of what baseline funding looks like. Now, if we start at the top left corner of the table, I know there's a ton of numbers here. So again, feel free to go back and watch the recording and pause it here and really digest this. But I'm going to talk you through it. The first column on the left is just time. It's the first 30 years or the next 30 years for this association. If I move from left to right, we'll see different numbers corresponding to each of those fiscal years. We've got your starting reserve balance here. We've also got the fully funded balance as of that year, which we then use to calculate percent funded. Now I'm going to stop here. If you don't know what I'm talking about, this is where you're going to want to go back and watch the first class, the fundamentals class, because this is why we explain percent funded and how we kind of contextualize what that means. But assuming you've covered that ground, now that we know what different levels of percent funded mean in terms of risk, we can make a determination. Is that a low, medium, or high risk position? Okay, moving to the right, our next column is the reserve contributions for that fiscal year. This one, I skipped over one here. It's basically just representing what was the increase over the prior year. So in this particular case, we were recommending $70,500, which was a 28% increase in the reserve part of the budget for this client. This is actually a real client that we worked with. Okay, next there's a column here if there's any need for loans or special assessments, if they've already approved one, if there's an immediate need for a ton of cash, sometimes we would have to recommend a loan or a special assessment right up front. In this case, we did not. Moving again to the right, we're showing the projected interest income for that year. Again, this client has over $1 million in the bank. They're not going to earn a ton of interest, but they get a little bit of cash going their way. And then finally, you have the projected reserve expenses for that fiscal year. Okay, so obviously this exists in a spreadsheet format, which makes it easy to start doing some math. Okay, if I just looked at the first year in this example, the year 2022 fiscal year, they had a starting reserve balance of about 1.1 million, which compared to their fully funded balance means that they were, which was a little over 1.2, they have a starting position of just about 90% funded, right? They're in a really strong position, this community. In this case, the next step is to figure out how much of a contribution rate, how much cash going into the account is required to at least meet the expenses and keep the starting cash balance above zero throughout the timeline. So what you see in this plan is that even though the association is starting from a strong position, they got a bunch of money to spend, right? They have a lot of expenses that are coming up in the next 10 years or so. Not every year, but especially in this 1 year, about 10 years down the road, they've got about 1.6 million, okay? So based on this proposed baseline funding level, gradually they're going to see that percent funded starts to drop. They are not doing enough to keep up with deterioration. And although the cash balance stays positive, at one point they get to a position where they have $245 in the bank, okay? Now, if you look at how much they should have, right, then they should have hundreds of thousands of dollars. But because this is above zero, then this plan is legal. This is permissible. So again, the state of Florida would call this sufficient. The owners would not have to vote to approve something less than this. I'm sorry, they would have to vote if they wanted to do something less than this. But this is not a good situation. This community is going from strong to weak in about 15 years, even though they're doing something that's legal, okay? All right, so now that we've talked about the minimum requirements, we'll switch over to the other end of the spectrum, which is the most conservative option, full funding or fully funding your reserves. All right, now I'm going to be real careful here. I'm using the term full funding in the context of a pooled reserve account, and I'm using the definition of that term that comes from National Reserve Study standards. Now, as I said before, and it's not anybody's fault, but it's just the way time has played out, most people in Florida have a concept of fully funding, which is what I just showed you. What we now know is actually baseline funding. So if you're interested, there's a bit of history on this. CAI, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, adopted the National Reserve Study standards, kind of the industry standards for a company like ours, back in 1998. All right, that was 4 years before pooled funding became allowed in Florida, right? So it would have been nice if when they started to allow pooled funding, if they thought it would be helpful to be consistent with the existing terminology that was already on the books at a national level, but here we are. So again, the definition of the term full funding that I'm using today means you're setting an objective to attain and maintain your reserves at or near 100% funded, which is why we spend so much time in that last class talking about the concept of percent funded and what that means, how to calculate that. So how does that look? Okay, now this is that same association that we just looked at a moment ago, but this time we wanted to design a plan for them that would fully fund, that would attain and maintain that position of being 100% funded. It's very important to understand that a lot of the numbers on this will have changed from the last slide or two, but the reserve expenses are the same, okay? In this case, we're just coming up with a different objective. All right, so now we know that the starting point is the same, that 89.9% funded. But in this case, the idea is that the contributions we set here will not only be enough to cover the expenses, but it will start increasing the starting cash balance, increasing the reserves relative to the fully funded balance, which we know in turn increases percent funded. Okay, so you see how that plays out. They're about 90%. They stay in a strong level the entire time. They never get out of a low risk position with respect to special assessments. This is another way to look at this comparison. Okay, so on this chart, I'm showing you percent funded on the left-hand vertical axis. On the bottom, again, is time, the 30 years in the plan. The different colored dots along the way are measuring percent funded based on some different alternatives. Now, again, they all have the same starting point. But if you look at the green dots, this is representing full funding. You see that percent funded stays strong the whole time. It kind of gradually increases up to the point where they reach 100%, right? It's attaining and maintaining 100% funded. The orange dots here represent that baseline plan, okay? So that plan actually looks okay for the first 10 years or so, but because they're kind of whittling away their cash balance, it eventually falls off a cliff, right? We allow it to get as close as possible to zero without going below. But what happens after that? They never really get back to where they could have been. They never get it back into a strong position again. So what about the difference to the owner? How does this play out in terms of costs to the actual individuals living here? Okay, you might remember the baseline plan in this example called for $70,500 a year in contributions. The full funding plan required $94,500. Now that's a difference of about 34%. It's 34% higher. That's actually a much more sizable difference than we usually see. In most cases, the difference between baseline funding and full funding is closer to like 15 or 20%. But even at 34% in this specific example, that came down to $15 per unit per month. Okay, so think about that for a moment. Less than $1 a day per owner in higher contributions to reserves meant the difference between doing the riskiest option possible and the safest, most responsible thing. Okay, now there's one other series of dots on here, which is the purple ones. That's the current plan that shows what they would, if they didn't increase their reserves at all, if they just kept doing what they had been doing, we leave that there to show you, okay, at the very least, you have to increase your reserves by some amount. This actually would go well below zero and trigger a special assessment. But while we're at it, while we're in the subject of increasing your reserves, although this is one option, for a little bit more, you'll be on a much healthier, fiscally conservative path. Okay, only got a few more slides here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the last option. It's pretty simple to understand. Basically, threshold funding is any objective between baseline and full. Okay, basically you pick a target and you design your funding plan accordingly. So for example, you could say, instead of becoming 100% funded, we just want to become 70%. Or another way you could do it is you say, we just want to make sure that we never drop below $1 million in our pooled reserve fund. Okay. Now, one of the problems with this approach is that it's much more subjective. You could have one board in one fiscal year that says they want the threshold to be 50% funded, and the next year you've got a different board in place and they say they want the threshold to be 20% funded. And we know that's going to have a significant impact on the dollar amounts involved, how much is going to reserves, but also the risks of each different plan. So those are usually unique scenarios that we'll design for a client using their input. But as we talked about on the last slide, it usually just makes more sense to fully fund, to try to get 100% funded than to pick a specific threshold anyways. Okay. Almost done, but our kind of grand finale today, I'm going to talk to you about one of the more frustrating parts of our business of doing reserve studies these days in Florida. But let me talk you through this. On the screen in front of you, I've got a paragraph that I copied from the Florida Administrative Code, which is basically the state's official interpretations of what is written in the statutes. And in the section where they talk about pooled reserve funding, they have this one sentence at the end, which I highlighted in red here, that talks about the funding plan not allowing for balloon payments. Now, I'm sure when they wrote this, they had good intentions. I think that the inspiration behind this was to prevent boards of directors from intentionally kicking the can down the road. However, the term that they used here in this context, balloon payment, has a very different understanding in most contexts. The general understanding of the term balloon payment describes a situation where, for example, you have a mortgage, and for the majority of that mortgage, the borrower pays a certain amount of money each month, and at the very end of the term, they make one single final payment, which is much larger than any of the payments that came before it. And if you think of that in association terms, I can see why it makes sense that would not be fair. Basically, they don't want an association to do the bare minimum, to do some small amount of funding for many years, and then at some point in the future, plug in a much higher amount of funding in a particular year where some project is scheduled to take place. Okay, so for example, let's say you've got a townhome community that needs to replace its tile roofs. I'm sure many of you have been through this type of project. That will typically be the largest expense in their reserve schedule by a huge amount. So let's say that tile roof project was scheduled 10 years from now. Now, the board sitting here today might be tempted to say, look, we can get away with doing a lower level of funding for the next 9 years if we assume that in year 10, we'll just plug in a really big number into the spreadsheet, and that's going to cover the cost of the roofs that year. what they're essentially doing in that scenario is committing that future group of owners, the ones who will be living there in 10 years, to pick up the tab. That would essentially be a balloon payment for those future people. And that allows the owners in the present day to get by with a lower amount of funding, which again, I think is not fair. I understand why they want to put a stop to that. Well, here's the problem. Over the last couple of years, it's come to our attention when we talk with associations, we talk with auditors, talk with accountants, that the term balloon payment in this particular context has been interpreted by the state, by the DBPR, to mean any increase whatsoever in the reserve funding amount. So for example, if I tell a client, hey, this year you need to contribute $100,000 to reserves, that's based on an analysis using the current replacement cost for all the things that you have, factoring in their remaining life expectancies. But next year, let's assume that costs will go up due to inflation, right? And in order to keep up with that assumption for inflation, you will have to contribute $103,000 in year 2. And then in year 3, costs continue to go up a little bit more, you should contribute a little bit more, and so on and so forth. Normally, I would say that's pretty reasonable, but the problem we've run into is that the state says, no, you can't have any increases in the contribution rate. That is a balloon payment. And then our response has been, well, wait a minute. You're allowing us and maybe even encouraging us to use some assumption of inflation in our reserve studies. That means the cost of the components that this association is saving up for will be increasing over time. We agree on that. But now you're telling us that we're not allowed to assume any increase in the contribution rate. It's a major problem, because now if we all agree that inflation is real and that costs will go up, but I'm not allowed to make the same assumption on the other side of the model that the contributions to reserves, the cash going into reserves, can also increase to meet those rising expenses. Well, now it suddenly gets a lot more expensive to make the plan work, to make this thing balance out. In other words, you're allowing the assumption that expenses will go up, but you're not allowing the assumption that income will also go up. Now, keep in mind, I still need to create a plan that meets these specific criteria we've been talking about, whether it's baseline or full. And in order to cover those expenses, all else being equal, I would have to use a much higher contribution rate in the early part of the funding plan to meet the objective. All right, now that it comes full circle. That places an unfair burden on the current owners. In that scenario, they're expected to pay more money than they should, okay? So when we complain about this, the response has been, well, then just take out inflation, okay? Don't assume that costs will go up, and that should balance things out. And that's the part that really, gets under our skin. We're in the business of delivering financial recommendations to our clients, and we're now being told that one of the key underlying factors when we're making these forecasts should be removed. Just doesn't feel right. No one in their right mind assumes that something that costs $10,000 today will still cost the same $10,000 15 years later. I don't think there's really any aspect of the economy where that's true. But in order to make these plans work, it's the only logical conclusion. So we take out inflation. That allows us to level out the funding contribution amount, and the state says that's appropriate. Well, what does that mean for you guys, for managers, and for the boards that you work with? Well, this is where you come in. That's where I'm going to ask for some help here. The message that we all need to reinforce to associations is that budgeting for reserves is an annual exercise. Okay, you cannot have a reserve study done one year and expect that you can use that same document for 3, 4, 5 years in a row, especially if you're not including any inflation. Okay, every association needs to produce a new reserve schedule every single year. That's just part of the process of doing your budget. And it's up to you guys to make sure that when you do that, that your costs for your components, the prices you use, are always going to be current for whatever the going rate is at that time. That's the only way you can realistically keep on top of things. In the same way that you have an annual audit done, there should be an annual reserve analysis, an annual reserve schedule done. That's just the bottom line. Okay, these are the restrictions that we have to work with. And it basically makes any forecast beyond year 1 of the plan unreliable, because it's not going to have inflation. It's not going to have any increases built in there. Now, the good news is that's a fairly simple exercise. If you're using a reserve study provider like us, or if you're just doing it on your own, not a whole lot changes from one year to the next. The real problem is that if you run that out for 3, 4, 5 years at a time using outdated information and assuming that that's accurate, that is when you're going to start to dig yourselves into a hole. Okay. All right, so we'll wrap this up in just a minute, open this up for Q&A. Just a few parting thoughts. If I've done my job, hopefully you guys agree that reserves are incredibly important, both in the present and in the future. Kind of a trick question there, but I would say mainly in the present is how you should characterize it. When you're designing your annual budgets, we would encourage you to, of course, think very hard, choose wisely about the method that you're using to do so. Now, once you've chosen that method, if you're going to go with the pooled method, you have one more choice to make, which is what is the long-term objective that you should be shooting for. Okay, when you're crafting those annual budgets, the goal should never be just to keep the dues low and keep your members happy. Okay, we are the leaders in this industry. So if you're a reserve specialist like me, a property manager like you, a board member that we're working with, it's all of our responsibility to educate the people that we're working with and to help them make those wise financial decisions. Okay, so thank you all very much. I'm going to turn my camera back on here, and feel free to start asking any questions. Appreciate you guys all sticking in. We've got, I think, just about everybody still on the line. So if there's any questions that you have, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll here, and I would love to get your feedback. We did this last time as well, and I appreciated everybody hanging in and doing that for me. So that poll is now live. Go ahead and fill that out, but I'm here for you guys. I will stay on as long as you like. If you have any questions, please submit those through the chat. If something occurs to you later on that you are, comes to you in the middle of the night, feel free to give us a call or shoot me an email, and we'll be happy to speak with you then. So yeah. All right. Thank you guys. I appreciate everybody hanging in with us. Thankfully, we didn't have the same Zoom problems today, our same internet problems, so that was great. But we will have the recording of this sent out probably within the next couple of days, hopefully by the end of the week. We're going to be submitting the course credits to the DVPR within the next day or two as well. All right. Thank you, Maria. So here's your question. Not adding any inflation, is it mandatory in the statutes, or is it just a recommendation from the DBPR? No, it's just a recommendation. So that's really the crux of the problem, is the state says you can assume whatever level of inflation you want. Go ahead and assume that costs will go up, as they surely will. I mean, our experience is that on average, it's about 3% per year is a very reasonable year-to-year average for costs going up. So that's the problem. We're assuming that costs will go up, but you want the contributions to reserves to stay flat. So in order to meet those costs, and again, keeping in mind that we have some goals we have to hit here, we can't let the reserve plan go below zero. That would mean I have to start off with a much higher contribution rate. And that's where they have the recommendation to just take out inflation, level both things out. It's just something that we fundamentally disagree with. It's not done like that anywhere else in the country. Maybe one day that will change, but for now, that's the problem. So yeah, you can absolutely include inflation to costs in your components over time, but where you will possibly get a red flag from the DBPR is if you're assuming that your cash will also go up. So great question there, Maria. Thank you. Okay, stick on for a couple more minutes. Again, if you want to send me an email, it's I'll share the screen again one more time. This is my email address here. Maria, thank you for your question. You say, to understand correctly, if a board votes for the pooled reserves, funds would be available for all line items. Why request to move any funds from any line item that requires member approval? Yeah, let's just talk through that again. If the board agrees that they want to have a pooled reserve fund, they can create that all by themselves. The owners have to vote to move existing cash into that pool. Once the money's in the pool, it is available for anything on the reserve schedule. So I want to make that clear. It doesn't become a slush fund that you can use for any project at all. It's not money that you can use to go out and pay your insurance bill or give all the staff a raise or anything like that. It is specifically limited only to those reserve components still. And so the idea is that when you pool the reserves together, now you don't have to get the owner's approval every time you want to spend money. It's collectively available for anything on the list. And people, if they're nervous about what power that might give to the board, I would tell them, well, the trade-off is, first of all, you should be having a responsible board in place no matter what. That's not going to drain your reserves on something stupid. That would be, arguably a breach of their fiduciary duty if they did that in the first place. But assuming that you're okay with pooling the reserves, the benefit is that it costs a lot less money to fund that model than it does the straight line model. So I don't know if that answered that. If not, please, give me a call or send me an email. We can talk about that some more. Carmen has another question here. My board member asked once if a reserve for asphalt already established to be funded yearly, could be different for 1 year. Sounds like a straight line situation. So if you have a reserve account already established for reserves, then you have to fund it yearly. That is, if that's the question, then yes. Once you've established a reserve account for something, you have to fund it yearly, unless the owners vote not to do that. And it just makes sense. Usually you have to repave your roads about every 20 years. So if you think of that being about every year, about 5% of the cost of the asphalt should be budgeted for, that's the way it should go. Because if you take years off, let's say you take 5 years off, now you're still condensing the full cost of that project into a shorter window of time. So it's eventually going to catch up with you and cost you more money for those later years. Okay, but yeah, so that might be an interesting scenario. And again, a lot of these scenarios are case by case. Let's see, Kim Marie, let me see if I got your question earlier. I didn't see it in the chat, but yeah, please feel free to email me and I'll definitely respond that way. Okay, let's see, we've got almost everybody's done the poll. Thank you guys for that. I appreciate all your feedback. So yeah, we're here if you need anything else. I'll give it just another minute or two. If people haven't asked any more questions, we'll sign out for today. But again, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure, and feel free to recommend this class to anybody else that you think might benefit from it. Pass it along to your boards. I think more often than not, board members are the ones that need to hear that. I think I'm preaching to the choir a little bit when I talk to managers. I don't think I have to convince you guys that this stuff is valuable, but if you've got, the treasurer, the finance committee chair, the people that are a little reluctant to go along with some of these things, this hopefully will help convince them a bit. Let's see. Okay. Oh, okay. Here's some more questions. All right, I found them now. All right, so Josie. Let's see, Josie's question, what is your opinion, should associations have pooled reserves or straight line? Absolutely pooled. There's really no significant drawback to having pooled reserves. I mean, that's how it's done almost universally throughout the country. I think, I don't make any bones about it in this presentation that pooled reserves is preferable. Kim, I got your question now. Here we go. I have a board member that insists they can use reserves for repairs. Example, tennis court resurface reserves, repair root damage with those same reserves. So that's an interesting one. It can be the case that you use reserve money for repairs to an item if it extends the remaining life expectancy of that item. So, you have tennis court resurfacing reserves, which are meant for recoating or resurfacing the playing surface on the tennis court. If you've got root damage, typically that's going to occur around the perimeter of the court where there's, trip hazards or trees that roots are lifting up the court surface. It's It's probably not ideal to use reserve money for that, but if the argument is that it's going to prolong the life and defer the need to do a complete resurfacing, then it could be a reasonable use of those funds. Another example could be a mechanical system where, for example, you've got something like a generator, and the generator overall is fine and still has some life left in it, but maybe it needs a new radiator, right? It just needs a new part replaced. Your reserves may say that those reserves are for replacement of the generator, but if you don't buy a new radiator, you're going to have to replace it right away. So in that case, you can replace the radiator, use the reserve money for that, and that buys you time before you eventually have to do a full replacement. So roof repairs, concrete repairs, anything that kind of defers or delays the need to do a more substantial project for the same thing usually is appropriate. Okay, Rad, I've got your question here. How often do you recommend we conduct a reserve study? How accurate are your reserve studies? Is an association tied to a reserve study once conducted? I have seen some that are astronomical and inaccurate and put the community in a difficult position. Those are all great questions. Okay, so to the first one, how often do you recommend we do it? In the state of Florida, there is no statutory obligation to do a reserve study at any given frequency. You don't have to do it. You don't technically have to do it at all. What I can tell you is that in states where reserve studies are required, so maybe the best comparison would be California, the state of Washington, places that have a lot of communities like Florida does, it's every 3 years. So every 3 years, you have to do what's called an update with a site visit, meaning somebody's coming back to the property and reevaluating the physical conditions and helping the board to stay on track. So, about every 3 years, I would say, is a good rule of thumb. But again, that reserve schedule needs to be updated annually as part of the budget. So if you're working with a company like us, typically there's what's called an update with no site visit that you could do in the off years, where you still get a new reserve schedule, you get professional guidance, but it's not the same cost as having somebody come back to the property. So about every 3 years is a good rule of thumb. How accurate are your reserve studies? Okay, I'm going to be a little bit biased here. I feel that our reserve studies are very accurate. I don't think we would have been in business for 35 years and done 60,000 of them if we weren't delivering value to our clients. So obviously I'm on a bit of a soapbox here talking about our company. I would say in general, though, that most reserve study providers are really good. We're in this business for a reason. A lot of us have engineering or architecture backgrounds, construction management backgrounds. We're an independent third party. We're objective, and this is all that we do. So compared to what the board might do on their own, or that the finance committee might put together on a spreadsheet, I would say you're generally going to be better off getting some professional help. In terms of accuracy, the goal is there is no such thing as a perfect reserve study. So we're going to have differences between what we estimate for life expectancies and costs compared to reality, especially if those projects are far out in the future. But the hallmark, the sign of a good reserve study is that it reduced the risk of financial distress, which is, again, going back to what we talked about today, I think another argument in favor of full funding, right? When you build up that higher margin in your reserve cash balance, even if you're inaccurate, even if you're wrong about what something costs or when it will take place, because you have that extra cushion of funds there, it will absorb those inaccuracies, and it makes it so that the community is not scraping by and having to come up with a special assessment. So, I think that generally speaking, they're as accurate as we can possibly be, recognizing that there is no such thing as perfection in this business. Now, your last question, is an association tied to a reserve study once conducted? No. No, this is just professional advice. So a client could, in theory, hire somebody to do a reserve study for them and say, thanks, we disagree, and we're going to throw this in the trash. I don't think that's a good idea. They will have wasted their money if they do that, but it is allowable. In other words, if you have a reserve study done, the state does not now say, hey, you must now follow this to the letter. You must use these components and these life expectancies and these costs and take it from there. It's still in the board's hand to decide what they're going to put in the reserve schedule. Now, Having said that, there's a counter argument, which is, if I was an attorney and a board said, yeah, we hired a reserve study company, but we didn't like them, so we just did it ourselves. The attorney might say, well, you paid somebody for professional advice and you totally disregarded it, so you better have a good reason for doing that. You probably wouldn't do that with your auditor if they were telling you, that your budget was out of whack or your financial statements were inaccurate. So I would say proceed with caution, but if the bottom line is if you're concerned that there's something wrong in the reserve study, talk to the provider and find out how did they come up with that number. Was that based on their experience? Did they get a quote from a vendor? How did they arrive at those conclusions? And hopefully there's a chance to revise it or come up with a slightly tweaked plan instead of just scrapping it entirely. Okay, let's see, I've got one more here from Martha. She says, can we include tree replacement as a reserve line item in a case where massive tree removals are required due to root road damage and the city requires tree replacement? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is maybe not such a good idea. So you can include tree replacement in your reserve schedule. The question is this a one-time issue or is this something that's going to recur over and over again? So it kind of depends on the scope of work. If you're going to rip out all of the trees that are causing all the damage, and you're not going to put any new trees back in their place that will cause the same thing, then it might be better to treat that as a separate one-time issue and just pay for it through the operating budget or maybe borrowing from reserves and paying them back. Compared to a situation where, let's say you're just going to take out 10% of your trees or the oldest ones that are causing problems in certain areas. But looking around, you can see, okay, some of the younger trees here will eventually become problematic too. We can foresee a case where this sort of problem happens again. Maybe now you start adding that as a reserve component that has a recurring nature to it. You say, okay, based on how long it took for these trees to mature to the point they were causing problems, if that took 8 years, 10 years, you can reasonably predict that 8 or 10 years from now, you might have that issue again. Then I would say absolutely that's something that you would want to consider in your reserve plan. So yeah, again, these are great questions. There's not always one right answer, but generally speaking, I think you guys get the idea. And I would definitely encourage you, if you didn't watch the first class, to go back and watch that one, talking a lot more detail about how to define a reserve component, what are the types of reserve studies, all that kind of stuff. So okay, let's see. I think that might be it. Still have most everybody on the line. But yeah, I'll hang on for just another minute or two. If there's anything else, please let me know. If not, then we will go ahead and close it out. So thanks, everybody. Again, my name is Will Simons with Association Reserves. Website is reservestudy.com. And you will be getting an email from us shortly with a link to the recording for this class, along with the slides. And if there's anything else we can do for you after that, just let us know. So it looks like we're done. Let's go ahead and close out. And I will say thank you, everybody. And we'll talk to you soon. Take care.